Hi, I'm Corey, and I paint some truly ratchet and nasty demons. Today, we're going to be painting the Demon Prince of Nurgle. I'm going to be working on the skin to start, so I'm going to be choosing some cool browns leading up to some greens and then a little bit of yellow for a highlight. I'll be painting brown into the recesses and slowly layering up from there. Also, a quick question here. Do you care about me listing paints? It's not something I use because I just kind of grab whatever feels good when I paint. But if it would be something that would actually be useful to people watching these videos, just let me know. So you'll notice I'm not waiting for paint to dry here. I'd rather paint wet on wet. It just saves me time blending and glazing in the long run. After futzing around with yellow for a little bit for a highlight, I kind of realized it just looks awful, so I abandoned it and I just switched over to just an off-white here to mix into my paint mixture here just for some of the highlights. I understand the point is he's supposed to look awful, but I want him to look pretty awful, not pretty awful. That makes sense. For a recess shade, I don't want to just slop it all over everything. I take just some regular purple wash and I mix in a little bit of brown and I start painting that into the recesses. The reason I do this instead of an all-over approach where I just dunk it on everything is I kind of want the option to glaze a little bit and add a little bit more purple in some cases, a little more blue, and start kind of blending that into places where it looks like the skin would be put under a lot of stress. Like if it's being yanked by this little hook at the top of his belly, or if it's being pressed into by different things. It's kind of how skin looks under trauma, right? Fortunately, because we painted that brown into all the recesses when we started the skin, that's what's going to provide our contrast, not just dunking it in whatever wash we happen to go with. I do end up actually using some of that yellow as well, but mostly for highlighting places that look like an overhead light source are really going to be hitting it directly. I'm going for some white armor here, so I start mixing some brown into the off-white I'm using for my armor mid-tone before applying an all-over wash of sepia and earth shade, just 1-to-1. Once everything's dry, I take my off-white tone and add in just the smallest amount of brown, and then I take a brush and I just start stippling that on. I'm choosing stippling here just because it's supposed to look kind of ruddy and worn, and it's also very quick, so that's nice. I keep up this process, moving closer and closer to pure white until I'm eventually almost at pure white and really just dry brushing the edges. I don't actually have any footage of it here for some reason, but I finish it off by highlighting some of the edges there with pure white. All right, now for some bone. My idea with bone here is to start very bright at the base and then have it get darker at the tips of the bone where it's grown out because it's been exposed longer and gotten dirtier. So I start with a white with a little bit of yellow added to it just for those really close sections, and I work my way up to a much richer yellow kind of brown color on top before applying a Agrax Earthshade and purple wash to the whole thing. I make 2 passes with the wash, making sure each time the brush is lifting off the model after each stroke close to the parts of the bone that I want to be the darkest. For my highlights, I just use the color that is the one that I originally mixed up for the base of the bone. At the end of it, I'm not completely satisfied with the gradient, so I go back with the wash and I add a couple more passes of glazing up to the top of the bone just to give it a little bit more contrast. My additional attempt at washing to create that contrast deletes my highlights, so I do the highlights again. This is, I guess, why planning is important, theoretically. All right, time for the cathartic, mind-numbing escapism of applying metallics to things. So I grabbed some Vallejo model color. I don't even remember what I used for this, probably burnt iron, one of the darker ones, and I just start slopping it on everything that will be kind of sort of metallic, with the exception of the copper elements. Speaking of copper, the Vallejo model color copper is great, but I am painting this for an army that uses Balthazar gold, so I mix them 2 and 2. I guess 1 and 1. I guess that's technically 2 and 2, 1 and 1. Same thing. Very stupid comment. Note to self: delete this. Yeah, so I mix that, and it's just easier to paint on, I find, that way, and it looks exactly the same as Balthazar gold. For the metallic washes, nothing special, just using Nuln oil for all of the metallics, with the exception of the copper, where I'm using Reikland Flesh Shade mixed with a little bit of Agrax Earth Shade, just to add a little bit of depth. Alright, so I'm gonna grab some different peach paint because I'm gonna be using some contrast to paint his little pouches here. And while the contrast paint is wet, I'm going to go back with the peach colored paint and immediately do my highlighting so that it blends into the contrast as I'm highlighting. And I don't have to do a bunch of glazing and stuff later, and it just kind of pumps it up a little bit more than if I just use the contrast on its own. For his cloak, I'm going for a purple effect, but I'm starting off with a blue and purple painted into the recesses, and then I'm going to move up to Warlord purple as a mid-tone, and my plan was to use yellow as a highlight, like I did before, but like before, I decided the yellow looks kind of crummy, and I just grabbed some of that peach that I was using earlier, and I end up mixing that into the purple for a highlight, and I find that that looks quite a bit better. Also, I spend all my time dancing around these stupid copper circles because I wasn't smart enough to paint them after. And at a certain point, I just like decide that life is too short and I just stop caring about them and end up painting over them. And then I just go back and touch them up, and it takes moments to do. So I guess that's where planning would come in, theoretically. So now for the reason everybody plays Death Guard, painting a bunch of rusty stuff. I take some Typhus Corrosion and I mix in a little bit of Troll Slayer Orange, just a little bit, make it a bit ruddier, and I start painting that along the middle of the sword. That's kind of where I want the rust to be creeping out from. Following that, I'm just going to take the pure Troll Slayer Orange and I'm just going to loosely dab it over the model. I'm not trying to overtake the brown, I'm just trying to complement it. These are supposed to be magically diseased weapons, so I take some Plague Bear Flesh contrast paint and I just loosely, lightly glaze that over the edges of the blade. I kind of feel at this point that it's not enough, so I grab some fluorescent yellow, I mix that into the Plague Bear Flesh, and just some key points, I work that in as well, and it does make it pop a bit more. I want it to look like there is like magical plague energy coming out of the middle of the sword, so I take that solution that I just made and I add a bunch of flow aid to it, which makes it go right into the recesses, and I paint that into the center of the sword. Once I'm done that, I take a little bit of white ink, I add that to the mixture, and I just kind of plug that in to the base, so it has kind of an ethereal effect, or even like a plasma kind of effect, like it's coming up from the base of the sword. For the rest of the regular metal, I just make a wash out of that Troll Slayer Orange, like heavily diluted, maybe 1:4, even 1:5, and I just brush that all over the metallics. Once I'm done that, I'll go back and edge highlight, like I'm doing with the sword here, but that Troll Slayer Orange wash does a really good job of making stuff just look naturally rusty just in one pass. All right, oil time. Everybody loves oils, except a lot of people don't use oils, and you don't have to use oils. You could absolutely do this with acrylic paint. It's just, I find it so much more forgiving and easy to kind of like play around with and smudge stuff around with oils. So if I got them, I'm going to use them. I start off with just this green, blue, and start working on all the parts of the copper that we would start getting some oxidation. When in doubt, I put the blue down though. It doesn't really need to be an exact science, but I'm making sure that I have it specifically on rivets or things where there is a point of contact. Once the blue is down, I can just take some titanium white and I can use that to emphasize places that are going to have a little bit more corrosion. I am so happy that it looks like he's crying oxidation. I didn't plan for that. I just really like it. So it wouldn't be Nurgle or Deathguard if there wasn't a bit of armor weathering. So I'm going back to that typhus corrosion and I'm adding little spots of battle damage. I'm mostly trying to stick to places that are like sharp edges, because those are the places that are going to get scraped and bump into things the most and get the most damage. But honestly, I just kind of put it in places that I think it's going to look cool. Once I'm done that, I take my off-white color that I originally used for the armor and I add a little bit of pure white to it. And I don't completely outline all the damage, but I do kind of box it off around like, I don't know, 70%. It just adds a little bit of depth. Oh look, a base. When did that show up? Don't rewind, it was always there. I wouldn't gaslight you. But yeah, I forgot to do a base before, so I'm just doing one now. Dry brushing it with Xandru dust, and then I'm putting a half Agrax, half Nuln oil wash over the whole thing. Nothing fancy. I decide I want a little bit more out of that battle damage, so I go and I grab some rust wash. This stuff's actually pretty strong, and I just start painting streaks with the brush, ending its journey at the actual battle damage, starting from the bottom and working up, so it kind of looks like rust has been slowly dripping down. Once that's done, I add a little bit of brown to that wash, and I go back and I add a few darker streaks here or there, just so that it doesn't look so completely uniform. With that, there's just a few finishing touches left. I decide that pigment powders are cool, so I get some rust pigment powders and I start throwing that all over the base. I also throw it on the armor because his little footies would probably be getting dirty walking around in it. I also take some water and I dab it around on his feet and legs so the oxidation kind of drips down and collects a little bit more organically the way that it would in some of the crevices of the armor. After that, I add some flowers, some brush, a little bit of Nurgle's Rot technical paint just for fun, and we're done. Statistically, most of you don't watch to the end of these videos. I can see from the metrics. So if you're watching this, I think you are very special and I like you a lot. And I hope you watch the next video too. Thanks for coming.